Hi, today we're going to be talking about chemical reactions and how they occur and how they relate to bioplastics because we've been talking about them for our project. So let's start by looking at how exactly we made our bioplastic. So a lot of your bioplastics came out looking something like this, and we made this by combining cornstarch and water and glycerin and vinegar in a pan, and we heated it up, and somehow it formed into this gel. And you all observed that the end result was very different from what it originally looked like. So how did this happen? Well, let's talk about what a chemical reaction is. A chemical reaction is when one substance turns into a new substance because of two or more different molecules interacting with each other. So in the last lesson, you learned that everything is made in our world is made out of atoms and matter, and when atoms are connected to each other, they make molecules. When you combine certain molecules together, sometimes they interact with each other in a way that forms a new substance. For example, when you add ingredients together to make cookies, when you bake them, the end result is very different from the beginning. And it's very similar to how our bioplastic worked as well. Another example of a chemical reaction is when you light a fire to a firework and it changes and causes an explosion and causes an array of color. That's another example of a chemical reaction. The beginning starting source is very different from the ending source. Now, we have two terms that you need to know when we talk about chemical reactions. The first term is reactant. Reactants are molecules that combine and interact with each other in a chemical reaction. In this diagram, we have four different chemical reactions shown, and the small circles represent molecules or atoms that are being combined together. On this side, we have the reactants. Products are new molecules that are made after the chemical reaction occurred. So you can see here in this diagram, we have A and B, the reactants, combining to form this new molecule or the product where A and B are combined together. Similarly, over here we have A and B as one molecule combined with C, which is another type of molecule or atom. These are the reactants, and that reacts to form a new molecule where A and C are connected and B is left as a separate molecule. So reactants and products. This connects to our bioplastic project because in our bioplastic project, the reactants were the starch, vinegar, and glycerin, and the product was the bioplastic. Now let's talk about what chemical bonds are. So in any molecule, we have atoms attached to each other because of this thing called the chemical bond. A chemical bond is a force that connects two atoms together because of shared electrons. And chemical bonds are what make molecules out of atoms. So here's a really famous molecule that you all know, H2O, or water. It's one oxygen bonded to two hydrogen. Now, a lot of times you might see diagrams that look like this, and they look complicated, but it's not. The O represents the oxygen atom, and the H represents hydrogen. The line in between represents the chemical bond. This line means that the oxygen atom and the hydrogen atom share an electron with each other. It might be easier to understand what this looks like in this diagram, which is basically the same thing, except all the electrons are drawn in. So you can see here, you guys remember the structure of the atom. We have the nucleus here with the protons and the neutrons, and around we have the electrons whizzing around. Now, hydrogen and oxygen here are both sharing these two electrons in the middle, and we call this a chemical bond because they're sharing the electrons. But because it's so tedious to have to draw these little dots, scientists like to draw them with lines because it's just easier, but they're the same thing. So now let's talk about how chemical reactions occur. So in chemical reactions, what happens is these bonds right here, in between atoms, get broken in the reactants, and then for the products, new bonds are created to form new molecules. So in this diagram, you can see here, we are combining a hydrogen molecule with chlorine. So if we draw that out, it's H dash H because the H's are bonded together through a chemical bond, and there's two chlorines that were bonded together. Now, in a chemical reaction, these two bonds are broken, and then they combine with each other to form a completely new molecule. So the H bonds with chlorine now, and there's another molecule that does the same thing. So this is a chemical reaction because there's a new substance being formed where bonds are broken and reformed. Now this is very similar to what's happening in our bioplastic, except in our bioplastic, the ingredients are not hydrogen and chlorine. The ingredients are water, vinegar, glycerin, and starch, and they're all combining together. The bonds are being broken, and there's a new substance being formed on this side. The product is the bioplastic. Now, there's two general types of chemical reactions. You may remember this from last year because I know that you have talked about this last year, but just to refresh your memory, the two types of chemical reactions are exothermic reactions and endothermic reactions. Now, these two terms, generally, they're talking about the energy it takes to form new bonds. So in this diagram, you can see an exothermic reaction. So in an exothermic reaction, it takes less energy to break the bonds of the reactants. So the arrows are really small here because we don't need a lot of energy to break these bonds. But to make the new bonds for the new products, it actually takes more energy to do that. And so there's a lot of energy released, and therefore in an exothermic reaction, there's heat released and the temperature increases. In an endothermic reaction, and you might want to remember this, endo means to take in and exo means to bring out. So exothermic heat is brought out, endothermic heat is absorbed. So in an endothermic reaction, it takes more energy to break the bonds of the reactants and less energy to form the new bonds. And therefore, overall total, more energy is absorbed than released, and therefore the temperature decreases in an endothermic reaction. And in this diagram, it shows how the arrows are bigger in the reactants because it's supposed to represent how it takes more energy to break the bonds in between these reactant molecules than it does to form the bonds in the product molecules. Okay, now here's an interesting question. So you might be wondering, okay, if these chemical reactions are happening, can't any of these atoms get destroyed or get lost in the chemical reaction? And the answer is no. In a chemical reaction, the atoms in a chemical reaction never get destroyed. You can't ever destroy an atom or change the atom into some other atom. That just doesn't happen during a chemical reaction. Instead, what happens in a chemical reaction is these atoms kind of get moved around into new locations to make new products. And so in this picture, you can see here, we have a methane molecule, which is a carbon atom attached to 4 hydrogen atoms, which are the white balls here, and 2 oxygen atoms, which represent these two, or actually 4 red balls that are attached into pairs. And these molecules are reacting with each other to form a carbon dioxide molecule and 2 water molecules. Now, if you count the total number of atoms, it's the same. So you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 hydrogen atoms here. 1, 2, 3, 4 hydrogen atoms on the product side. We have 1 carbon atom on the reactant side and 1 carbon atom on the product side. And we have 4 oxygen atoms on the reactant side, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4 oxygen atoms on the product side. And so you can see the total number of atoms never changed. It's just the way these atoms are bonded together are different, and that's how chemical reactions work. Now, this rule applies to any reaction, so keep that in mind. You can't ever destroy atoms, and you can't ever change atoms into another type of atom by removing protons or neutrons. That's different from a chemical reaction. Okay, now let's talk about how do you know if a chemical reaction is occurring? Well, there's several things that you can look for. You have to look for a chemical change. Basically, a chemical change can be one of the following. If there's heat or light emitted, there's a change in color, if there's a formation of a precipitate, or a precipitate is a fancy word for a solid substance, or if there's a formation of a gas. That's how you know if a chemical reaction is occurring. Now, finally, let's talk about temperature. So, adding temperature to a chemical reaction causes the atoms in the chemical reaction to move faster. And because they move faster, they actually interact with each other more frequently and at a faster rate. So that will actually speed up the chemical reaction and make it occur faster. So in this diagram, you can see here, there's atoms or molecules that are supposedly interacting with each other like this. They're coming together and they're moving apart again. And because they're kind of slow, it's not really causing any kind of chemical change. You can see here, these molecules are kind of staying the same here. Now, if we add heat, that causes these molecules to move around really fast, and that extra energy is going to cause these molecules to bump into each other at a higher rate, a higher kinetic energy. And because of that, because of the extra energy, these atoms are bumped off and they actually get switched. You can see here the atoms got switched, and that actually caused a chemical reaction because the chemistry or the arrangement of the atoms is totally different from the reactants. And so heat can actually increase the speed and also cause extra energy to allow these chemical reactions to occur. Now, this connects to our bioplastic experiment because for the bioplastic to actually turn into, for the ingredients for the bioplastic to turn into the bioplastic, you have to add the heat. If you just mix the chemicals and the materials together and you just let it sit there without heat, it actually doesn't have enough energy to create that bioplastic. We have to add that heat so there's enough energy for those atoms and molecules to kind of bump into each other and to cause new changes in the arrangement of the atoms. Yep, and that's it.